Let's quickly go around the room introducing ourselves. We should begin with the guest of honor, who needs no introduction, but please.
Hi, my name is Rukmini. I'm a journalist based in Chennai, India.
Ashu, please.
Ashutosh Varshney, I'm director of the Success Center, professor of political science.
I'm Sam. I'm a junior studying IAPA. I'm Lily, also a junior studying IAPA.
What track?
IAPA.
Development.
I'm Fasada, also studying IAPA on the development track.
Shreya, postgraduate student in political science. I'm Anushka. I'm also studying IAPA. I'm also a first year. I'm a junior studying IAPA.
I'm Sweta. I'm a third year undergrad studying IAPA development and computer science.
Anushi, PhD student in economics.
I'm Priyanka. I'm also a third year student doing development and environmental science.
Hi, I'm Mark Davies. I'm an assistant professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, but on leave this semester.
I'm Anita, I'm a grad student in business studies.
Devi, I'm a faculty member in political science and political science.
Anthony Franco, I attend the Watson events calendar.
Hi, I'm Sarah Pumita. I'm a student in Master of Public Affairs. I'm Chameli. I'm also a Master of Public Affairs.
I'm Direct Gabrielle, I'm a third year student studying development history.
I'm Francisca. I'm a junior studying IAPA and economics.
I'm Sangeeta. I'm a postdoc here at Watson.
Good. My name is Arvind Subramanian. I'm a senior fellow at the Watson Center. Delighted that all of you could join us for what is going to be a terrific talk. So if those of you who follow kind of international economic journalism, I would say that there have been two pieces that have come out in the last 2 weeks, which have been which have, I think, caught the attention of a lot of people. 2 or 3 days ago, the Financial Times, a data writer now called John Murdoch Brown, showed a chart in which he shows that under Xi Jinping's regime, the number of data items that the Chinese were putting out has declined just dramatically. At its peak, it was something like 18,000 or something pieces of data, and now it's down to 5,000. So basically, data has disappeared or disappeared from the Chinese ecosphere. A week before that, The Economist had this very kind of telling chart which showed which countries are over-reporting their GDP based on night lights. And of course, China was the most prominent. And it's based on a paper in an academic paper which says that, unfree regimes are more likely to, on average, to misreport or over-report their GDP. And of course, China featured very prominently. And of course, in the middle rung of countries, India was there as well. So I think there's no doubt that the rise of democratic authoritarianism in liberal democracies around the world has also coincided with the kind of post-truth world that we're seeing around the world. On a more personal note, when I was in government and thereafter, I've also kind of waded into this territory of, good and bad data and over-reporting and under-reporting of data. And the last piece of work I did actually drew heavily upon Rukmini's own work. Fantastic work during the COVID period, which many of us drew upon. So let me then, therefore, it's a good time to segue into introducing Rukmini, who is going to talk about her book, Whole Numbers and Half Truths. And of course, you can see Pinocchio's nose there on the cover. Rukmini really doesn't need any introduction. She's started work with the Times of India, but then she became the first data editor in a newsroom in India, first with the Hindu and then with the Huffington Post. She has many, many awards, which, I don't want to read out because that will come in the way. But also she's backed this up with some amazing investigative reporting in the last few years. So it's going to be a real treat. And without further ado, Rukmini, the floor is yours. Let's say 25, 30 minutes, and then we'll take Q&A from the audience. Yeah?
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you, Professor Vashni, and thank you for that warm introduction. I'm very pleased to be here, and I look forward to questions, particularly from students. Thank you. Particularly from students afterwards. Nothing is off limits or a holy cow, so feel free to ask me burning questions about India, data, the book, writing, whatever you want after the talk. I've been a journalist in India for some time now. Straight out of journalism school, I ended up doing what rookies in all professions do, which is you are dispatched to the sort of furthest reaches of the city where the more important people have more pressing things to do. So you, as the junior person, are sort of dispatched, as I was, first to the sort of ends of the city of Mumbai that I reported on at the time, then the wider state, the region it was in, and then increasingly across the country to report on things from elections or sort of, big tragedies, slum demolitions, cultural movements, all this sort of stuff across the country. And I didn't realize it at the time, but in hindsight, I feel like what I was being essentially paid to do was to understand the nuts and bolts of Indian democracy as they operate on the ground. And this went on to be very helpful when I made this turn towards data journalism sort of midway through my career. I had never studied maths, stats, politics, economics, science, anything of any particular use. So at some point after doing this for a while, I decided to do... I studied psychology, but do not ask me why. I have no good reason. I drifted into it at age 18, like one of many vices that you might drift into at age 18. So I don't remember a word I studied from there. It's not made me at all perceptive. So I did this sort of master's in development studies halfway through, and I was exposed to both qualitative and quantitative research around India for the first time. It had never truly occurred to me that there were people out there doing work around India and South Asia. And so when I returned to India to work, all I knew is that I had this notion that I wanted to incorporate the research I had encountered into my field reporting. I don't think I thought of it as data journalism at the time, but that's what it went on to be. So the very first story I was dispatched to do was around food insecurity, because this was the time in 2009 and 10 when the prices of essential food commodities had escalated dramatically. And I was sort of parachuted into one of the poorest parts of the country to report on food insecurity, which is the sort of standard operating procedure for how journalism across the world is conducted. So I landed in this, poor part of the country to look at what was happening about, how households were taking decisions around food, what it meant for household budgets. But for the first time, I felt sort of semi-armed with things like, I now knew that IFPRI has a global hunger index, so I thought perhaps I could mention that in the report. I knew a little bit about where to look for the consumer and retail prices of things like dal. So I thought I could look at those prices and see whether it had affected consumer decisions. I think I was sort of lucky to sort of coincide with what then ended up being the ascendance of data journalism in India, to the point that now every Indian newsroom would typically have one, if not more, data journalists. It's a good time to be a data journalist in India. What that journalism looks like and what the future of it is a conversation we can have afterwards. So the book sort of came out of the idea of bringing together, I always try to behave as if this is purposeful, but that this is my way of getting people to buy the book by putting up an slide about but the point I'm trying to make is that I looked at 10 big questions around how things operate in modern India. Things from crime to politics to the consumer economy, gender, and try to answer it through a combination of what good data can tell us, as well as things that the data misses, loopholes in the data, or even areas in which the data misleads, which is something I'll go on to talk about. So essentially what I was trying to do was pull together these two sets of experiences I had had as a reporter, which in terms that might be more familiar to you now strike me as qualitative and quantitative work in a way coming together. So one of the points I do try to make, particularly to younger people in India, is that it's important to think of the early days of India's statistical architecture and the sort of, the decolonizing thinking behind all of the institutions that were being put in place then, and the contribution of these two men, Jawaharlal Nehru and P.C. Mahalanobis, to the statistical architecture that was put in place then. And the reason this matters is because to some extent it explains some of why India's statistical architecture looks the way it does, as well as so some of the reasons why it still stands in a way, as well as some of the things, we can consider what was not put in place then and what leaves a lasting legacy of lack, of absence. History is never the story of two great men, and I'm not going to argue that these are the two men responsible for India's statistics, especially now. But it's important to think of that moment of sort of audaciously building a statistical architecture that we had no money or levels of development to even be dreaming of, and why that was and what it was supposed to mean for India's sort of planning and development. I'm going to quickly go through 5 broad themes in this talk, and I'm going to dive right into the first one, which is that there is sometimes a notion that because people like Arvind or me or others point to problems with India's data, there is sometimes a notion, particularly among younger journalists in India, that there's no good data around India and data cannot tell you anything particularly useful, that it's all a sort of mess. And I do try to draw a bar of what is good data. That is why I sort of re-emphasize good data, because I think it's important to figure out what can data actually do, and it's essential to sort of remind people, particularly in India's elite bubbles, and I very much consider myself a sort of card-carrying member of India's elite, that there is sometimes a notion that the people you talk to or the world you encounter is what India is. And statistics are something that's cold, that's on a paper, and statistics don't get the real India. But I try to sort of push back against that to argue that statistics sometimes tell you stories about India that India's elite would miss if they only spoke to each other. So one of the points I try to make is around the role of ideas and ideology in Indian elections. So there's, India's media has this sort of morbid fascination with the power of money in Indian elections. And sure, there's money, and it's a sort of, it makes it unusual perhaps from some other circumstances. But by talking sort of exclusively about the role of voters taking money in elections, we sometimes describe, we don't accord the same respect to the Indian voters to sort of think about their own ideas and ideologies the way we sometimes do to other contexts. And this chart and this data assembled by the political scientists Rahul Verma and Pradeep Chibbar shows, for example, that the ideological beliefs of voters who typically vote for India's 2 largest parties are remarkably consistent over time. So you would actually call these fairly ideological people. And this isn't something that's hard to encounter. So I have a story in the book, for example, about a conversation with 2 women voters. And both of them have taken money from the political parties they plan to vote for the next day. But that's not it. They have a lot more to say about why they're voting for the party they choose to vote for. One of them considers it a feminist vote. She wants to vote for a party that's led by a woman because she thinks that's essential. The other one is voting for a party who she believes stands for social justice and federalism. All of these are sort of elevated concepts which sometimes get flattened in our reporting of Indian elections. The other point I do try to make often to the Indian elite is that this notion that intercaste mixing, particularly in the context of marriage, is now extremely common because this is something people encounter among their own friends, is not borne out by the data. The share of intercaste marriage among people in their 20s in India is no different from what it was among people who are now in their 90s. Young Indians and their grandparents essentially got married in just as endogamous a fashion as their grandparents did, and I don't think this is something many among India's elite are willing to confront. I think there's a particularly sort of sharp and damaging dimension to not paying attention to enough data around health. And this means that we went into the pandemic, about which I'll talk a bit at the end of this. We went into the pandemic without sort of basic understanding of how people access healthcare, what the barriers to it are, where the poor go to access health, even among just levels of falling sick. So one of the things that happened between India's first and its truly brutal second wave is that there was a lot of conversation around why don't the poor seem to be particularly affected? Why aren't poor Indian states affected? Why are their numbers so low? What's going on? Is it the BCG vaccine? Is it some inborn immunity? And there was also a sense that non-communicable diseases, which we now know are significant risk factors, there's often a sense that these are lifestyle diseases that affect India's sort of indolent rich and don't affect the poor, which we now know from data is not borne out well by the data. So it's a good chance that we were missing the role of comorbidities in the vulnerabilities of the poor between these two waves, in which we essentially just didn't pay enough attention to thinking about how disease spreads. So that's the question of do we have good enough data, and are we learning enough lessons from good data? But the sort of biggest issue to me around data in India is the sort of uncritical and very problematic way in which data without context is presented to the public, which goes on to lead to not just damaging or misleading perceptions. In the case of crime, I argue that it goes on to lead to problematic laws that will leave a shadow across my lifetime. So one of the things that happened in 2012 following the brutal assault of a young woman in Delhi is that there was this sort of outpouring among women of a need for a long overdue conversation around sexual violence and sexual assault. This was essential, this had to happen, it was clearly long overdue. But what we used as our way to understand, or sort of as a proxy for the experience of violence, was police statistics. And I'll argue that this is a dangerous way to think about crime in India. So in this chart, on the horizontal axis, you see violence as reported to the police per capita. And on the vertical axis, you see violence as women say that they experience in surveys. Of course, the DHS comes with all of its problems. Household surveys are not going to fully capture sexual violence as experienced by women. But be that as it may, this is what the data looks like. So I argue that we typically look at the bottom right quadrant. That's what makes it to the news. Those are the Indian states that report the highest levels of per capita violence to the police. And you'll see Delhi there. And because of that, what ends up happening is the biggest sort of policy response being more policing and more street lights on the streets of what is already one of the richest parts of the country. While the top left quadrant is the one that worries me the most. These are the states with the lowest levels of crimes reported to the police, but the highest levels that women say that they experience in household surveys. So there's multiple problematic sort of directions going on in that one quadrant. And without the sort of triangulation that you are unlikely to see in an Indian newspaper, you're never going to get any closer to sort of this slightly more complicated way of thinking about it. There is a bigger problem with the way we report.
Which states, if I may ask?
Bihar and
Bihar
and Madhya Pradesh are among them. And there is a further dimension to this, and which is where it gets particularly dangerous. From having been a field reporter, I knew that using police statistics as a way to understand crime is always going to be problematic because of the sort of push and pull of social forces that go on in a police station that often have very little to do with the objective truth. So I started looking at court cases because that at least offered me slightly more documentation and the ability to have conversations with prosecutors, families, police, judges in Delhi. So I looked at 1 calendar year of reported sexual assault as it went through the judicial system. And what I ended up finding was that 1/3 of all cases that made it to the judicial system as sexual assault were actually consenting relationships between couples who were often intercaste or interreligious, against whom parents had put these charges. Which is unsurprising to anyone who sort of understands the social control that young people experience. But it's, you have to think of the additional dimension of the control over sexual agency, which is, the area of the highest possible control. And then when you think of this in the context of the huge sort of clampdown on intercaste and particularly interreligious relationships, often supported and weaponized by the law in parts of India, I feel like that 1/3 is, going to rise to a half or even 60% in the years going ahead. So what does it mean when you see an unvarnished number of increased sexual assault, and what does it mean for what's actually going on behind it? When I talk about, all of my belief in India's data, I don't want to come off as glib and sort of seem as if there are no problems with the data. We'll talk about some of the problems of access and of publication further on, but I also want to talk about some sort of definitional crimes that we sometimes commit, where the data is there, but the way it's defined in official statistics creates problems. So just by sort of hanging around the National Crime Records Bureau, which looks at crime statistics after 2012, I discovered entirely by chance that India follows what is called the principal offense rule in the registration of crime. This means that suppose someone broke into your car, took your cell phone, and also sort of bumped you on the way out. The police complaint would include perhaps a motor crime section for having broken into your car. It would include theft and perhaps also simple assault because they bumped you on the way out. Only the police section that carries the highest possible sentence makes it to official statistics. This is ostensibly to prevent undercounting or double counting, sorry, not undercounting, overcounting, to prevent double counting. But the result is that we officially undercount all crime except murder, the highest possible. And what I found was that what had brought me to this office was me trying to understand the 2012 assault of that young woman. And this case that sort of changed our discussion around sexual assault in India was not registered as a sexual assault in India's police statistics. It went down as a murder because that was the highest possible charge. After I wrote about this, my newspaper was, there was an angry response from the government, from the Crime Records Bureau, which said that this is a system followed by others, etc. It's true. It's not, India's own invention. But they'd never mentioned it in an asterisk or italics or, a small description anywhere. In the years going forward, they've added it to the limitations and disclaimers. So at least that happened. The other one that I enjoy very much is just how sort of ossified in time India's official definitions of work have got. Because the world of work has changed dramatically, but definitions have not. So this one's actually not from the census, it's from the National Classification of Occupations, which feeds into other data sets. And in that classification, we have Code 121, Directors and Chief Executives. By official data, this is the most common occupation for urban men in India. Directors and CEOs. And the third most common occupation for urban women, which makes it sound like an extremely high-collar, sort of, high-flying economy, except that of the women workers described as directors and chief executives, 99% were actually self-employed. And of them, 1/3 worked as unpaid family helpers. These were women working unpaid on their husbands' vegetable carts and samosa stalls, essentially, described as directors and CEOs in the official classification. So those are sort of definitional crimes. And then I'm going to sort of bring together my fourth and fifth points together. The fourth point is around, does India lie with statistics? Is there a lot of official manipulation? And the fifth point is around sort of the way forward. So the sort of what's seen as the biggest example of lying with numbers in the last few years, I'll steer clear of the GDP, but the other sort of biggest crime is seen as COVID, right? There's got to be some sort of lying going on there. How else would you reach a situation where India's official estimate of deaths from COVID after the summer of 2021 was 500,000, while the WHO's estimates were 5 million. How would you come to a 10x underestimation otherwise? And why?
The WHO's estimates came a year and a half later.
Yes, but I mean, India's not revised it a year and a half later. That moment of time.
I'm saying even the WHO only provided it a year and a half, unfortunately.
Yes, I mean, if the government takes 10 years even to come to a better number, I don't have a problem with that.
WHO have provided, without government's permission, 5 million deaths because WHO and other UN agencies they need host government's permission to publish something.
I'll come to that in a minute because they don't have the government's permission for this number. It is they don't.
Okay.
They have it's an unaccepted number. So there's an asterisk there in the WHO's report.
Okay.
But there's a story that we'll talk about later.
Yes. So sort of the broader argument I want to make is that, sure, we can talk about, examples of changes in methodology that produce different answers and talk about whether that is manipulation by another name. We can talk about whether delaying or not releasing data is, in a sense, manipulation by another name. But I do want to also talk about the sort of structural and legacy issues that lead to bad numbers that aren't about manipulation but that matter a lot. And in fact, I think that manipulation is actually an easy answer to reach for because it makes you picture a sort of all-powerful bureaucrat with his grubby fingers on the numbers, changing them for clear political objectives. That needs less work in terms of pushing back. This needs much more work. So I just want to tell you a quick story of how we've got to this difference. First is the question of why should we believe that there's something off with the numbers? Why shouldn't we just believe India's numbers? Well, in the early days of the pandemic, there was no possible explanation for why India's numbers were so much lower than in the rest of the world. More importantly, within Indian states, there was no good explanation in the early days of the pandemic for why some states were reporting much higher numbers than others. So the question the question many asked themselves between the first and the second waves was, is there something exceptional going on in India? While I believe that we wasted a lot of time with that question, and the question we should have been asking is, why is there something exceptional in the Indian data? The question was really around the data. So one of the reasons we should be skeptical about COVID data has nothing to do with COVID. In 2017, India's official count, death count from malaria was 192 deaths, while the IHME's modeled estimates, with an asterisk for all of the problems that go along with the IHME's modeled estimates for the same year were 50,000. That is a 40x underestimation that there was neither any media coverage of nor any government pushback against. So we've done a bad job for many years of accurately counting deaths from disease. This has been slightly updated in the last year or so, but we also went into the pandemic without administrative abilities that were able to capture all deaths. Particularly in rural areas and more likely among women and marginalized groups, we do miss some deaths. We have a huge problem with medical certification of death. India's richest and most developed state of Kerala still medically certifies, means a certificate that establishes cause of death, just 1 out of every 5 deaths, India's richest, most developed state. We've simply not got these systems working well where we have an established medical cause of death. And then there are some pandemic specific issues, one of which is this. While we officially adopted the WHO's classification of what should count as a COVID death, on the ground, state governments only accepted deaths that had COVID positive test prior to death as COVID deaths. Reporting by me and others has shown that not a single state accepted suspected COVID deaths as official deaths, although the WHO required us to do that. There were supposed to be 2 codes. And then when the second wave hit, this was no longer a debate. I mean, it's hard sometimes to explain just how hard the wave hit virtually every Indian household. I mean, you would be hard pressed to find an Indian household who doesn't know someone who died in India's second wave. And so it became all the more imperative to figure out what was going on with those numbers. So early attempts were extremely low tech, and to me, which leads into my last point about, how can we come together? There is a sort of, flowering of public-spirited movements around the country, some of them allied and in touch with government, sometimes outside government, and some even within government, to make data in a non-partisan way available to people, as simple a sort of statement as that. And here's one great low-tech solution that came out of Kerala in the early days. These were local doctors in Kerala who knew their communities very well. They served their small local communities and knew that there are people in their communities who are dying from COVID who are not making it to the official count. Now they knew this because Kerala's official bulletin had the names of people dying from COVID. So there was that sort of ability to bring in accountability. And all they did, it went as high-tech as a Google spreadsheet. So they opened a Google spreadsheet, they put down the names of people who they knew from obituaries and media coverage had died of COVID. On the other side, they would have the government's list, and every time someone made it to the government's list, there would be a check mark, otherwise there would be a, hey, why hasn't this person made it yet? And I believe it actually fed into accountability in the state government, because every few months, Kerala would do a huge reconciliation and pull together a large number of deaths that had been missed out. To the point that what finally ended up happening was that Kerala likely underestimated deaths at the smallest ratio of any Indian state. So it was reporting high numbers, but as we now know, it just meant it was underestimating less. So this was one of the early efforts. What also began to happen in non-English newsrooms in non-big cities was local reporters at much greater risk and cost than those of us in English newsrooms experience, feeling that they had to do something to better serve their communities because they knew that they were seeing these huge numbers that weren't being reported. So this often meant looking at registers that looked like this, paper registers that had the names of people from crematoria and burial grounds and sort of comparing them against official statistics. And hospitals as well. So what some of us did, and I'm going to speed past this a little faster, is essentially the same thinking but use civil registration system data, which is meant to sort of count every death. So what we did is we said, these are the number of people who die in typical years, these are the number of people dying in these years, what's going on, we can't assign cause, we're not equipped to do that. So this was one of the early ones which looked at the city of Chennai. Now the city of Chennai uploads all death certificates to its municipal website. So you can get a count for every day going back decades. And it showed that, okay, there's some sort of spike going on in the second half of 2020, but this was before the second wave. This is what the state of Madhya Pradesh looked like. Now if you look at that middle graph, Madhya Pradesh typically records 30,000 deaths every May. That's how many people typically die in that state every May. It recorded 160,000 deaths in May 2021. So there was no heat wave, there was no great outbreak of disease. It's entirely likely that a large share of these were deaths from COVID. This chart from Andhra Pradesh looks so similar that it almost looks like the same chart with different colors and sort of points to how sharp that second wave in particular was. And without getting into too much detail, if you look at the color-coded chart, it just makes the point I was making earlier about the levels of underestimation of different states. These were very variable. And if you look at Kerala, which is the darkest green, it likely had the lowest rates of underestimation given that it had been reporting higher numbers earlier. One thing that I generally encourage doing is trying to triangulate with other sources of data. So this was using the National Health Mission's data, which isn't meant to count mortality. It isn't meant to look at deaths, but it showed this sort of huge spike in deaths from fever and unknown causes. And these are sort of academic estimates, some of them updated, that were produced using this the point that I mentioned earlier, which is that I was not equipped to ascribe cause, so this I left to other people. I'm just going to try and end with two sort of big learnings from this. One is that to me the big silver lining of the last 2-3 years has been this coming together of a public-spirited community in India, some of them with tech abilities who have other day jobs but want to use their tech abilities to do good, whether it is coming together around floods. They sometimes sort of pull together, hey, how can we dispatch resources to the people who need it most, just perhaps working out of a spreadsheet. Sometimes it is bringing together COVID data and thinking of how to sort of support this community of people, whether with tech abilities or not, to do a better job of this is something that perhaps as well. Simultaneously, I don't want this to seem as if it means that it absolves a democratically elected government from producing the data that it needs to produce. But there's no point me saying this and sort of ending here. So thinking about what are the safeguards that we need to make sure that data that was produced as part of the official system but never made it to public view, what do we do when that happens beyond hand wringing? Do we need to think about legal protections? Do we need to use this moment to think about what India's National Statistical Commission should look like, beyond what Mahalanobis and Nehru thought of back then? What should it look like, and what is the sort of both the political and the legal mobilization we need to do to make that happen? So those are the sort of three broad points I'd like to leave you with. Thank you.
Rukmini, thank you for that fantastic tour of the horizon of what's happening in India. Let me abuse my privilege as the moderator. Just ask two, fairly pointed questions. That first, having said everything that you have about, structural problems, long-standing problems, etc., etc., is it your sense that things have gotten worse in the last few years? I don't want to provide any dates, but generally, so there's clearly, just to be fair and just consistent with what you said, I mean, there's been a general structural deterioration in capacity more broadly, but has that been aggravated by things having gotten worse over the last year? The second question is you speak in terms of what can be done. One, of course, as you said, public-spirited, kind of like the non-government civil society coming together. Then you talk about maybe legal protections, NSC things. But I want to ask you another thing is why should we, just as you have interstate variation, some good and some bad, on the economic front, GDP, employment, consumption, would part of your solution be to have, every state, for example, setting up its own, NSS or some statistical commission, so you can actually get this, kind of let's competition between states, as it were. We're a big country. Why should everything be central? Why should there be one national statistical, whatever body or whatever? So if you could just respond to those two questions. And before I finish, so please at this stage, all of you turn on your mics because this is being recorded. So if you want your question to be recorded, which we do, just blanket turn on your mics and then those will get recorded. Okay.
Thank you. So do I have it on? I'm not sure.
Yes, it's on.
This is on, right? Okay. Okay. Yeah. Have things got worse? Yes, I do think it's important to sort of make a note of what are the things that are, historical legacy issues and what have got worse, because there's no point, being warm and fuzzy and making it all seem the same. And on that count, I think, so the National Statistical Commission's issues predate the current moment, and problems again with sort of consumption estimation also predate the current moment. We've had, if this is 2.0 of the poverty debates, it's because there has been a 1.0, which was earlier. But there are some things that are significantly different right now. One of which is, and I make this point, with no bones in the book, that the fact that in 2019 the consumption expenditure survey was not released is a break from the past. It's not that arguments about it are new, but to then decide unilaterally that because you feel that the methodology is off, as the government says it did, you decide not to make it public. That has never happened before, and I think, you feel sometimes about things, how did someone in this generation let this pass? And I feel about this, that how is it that it's been now 3 years since this wasn't released, and it went down without much of an issue. Similarly, I feel this about the National Health Mission's data, its administrative data, that after I used it to write these numbers, it went offline for a year. And it was not taken up by any other media, didn't become a political question, no questions asked in Parliament about it. So those are enormous breaks from the past. We are also seeing now currently some trouble over the
Manrega.
No, the census of enterprises, what is it called?
Economic census.
Economic census, which is now delayed, and there are again questions about the methodology. So those are all breaks from past. I also think the sort of, the extent of hypercritical attacks on either people using the data to say unflattering things of the government, or sort of attempting innovations in data, the tone and tenor and extent of pushback against it is also unusual. To have the government put out rebuttal after rebuttal after rebuttal for the WHO's data, often in very sort of ad hominem terms, is unusual.
They also did it to the GDP stuff.
I see.
Ad hominem rebuttals.
I see. Okay, so none of us here are untouched. So those are unusual, and those deserve talking. And in a way, they also deserve talking about in the context of the fact that on some counts there is now so much more data and in such better shape than ever before. We now have the NDAP, which allows not just access to digitized data, but also allows merging data sets, which I know would make the hearts of people with better abilities than me glad, because it appears to be something people have long wanted to do with data, which they haven't been able to. So there is that too. So particularly in that context, then using data to say things that the government sees as critical, and then that pushback against it becomes all the more sort of hypocritical in a way, if you are committed to making more data available. On your second point, I see that happening quite a bit actually. I see quite a lot of state governments seeking help with doing more at the state level. There is now improved state capacity in many states to be able to do this. There are also a lot of academic institutions that are setting up across states that can assist governments to do this. But given the, almighty mess that administrative data, especially at the state level, often is across the country, I don't think we should underestimate just how much work it will take to make state level data or state produced data decently usable. And I believe that just as India follows international conventions on many of its other key data sets, states too have to demonstrate that they are going to meet some certain conventions. Otherwise saying, the government doesn't do a good enough job here, we have this data set, just on that alone is not going to work. But yes, I do see this. For example, and in fact there's also a lot of state level questioning and sort of academic criticism of nationally produced data, which is valid and which needs to happen, because the closer you are to where this data, to the place the data is talking about, the closer you can come to figuring out what's actually going on. So for example, in Tamil Nadu, 2 members of the state's planning commission wrote a piece looking at the NFHS, the most recent NFHS data. And their point was not that the NFHS is making us look good or look bad, which is typically how states respond to national data. But it was that there are some inexplicable things going on in this data. That some things make us look better than we think is right, because things took a hit in the pandemic. So how come, X and Y indicators have improved? Some things make us look worse. So that sort of criticism and sort of engagement coming from states is also, I think, hugely welcome.
Floor is open. Ashu, shall you go with the students first, and then you...
Students first, yes.
So, okay, I abused it, sorry about that.
No, as moderator you could.
Okay, but we'll come back to you, Ashu. Anyone else? Students? Faculty? Yeah.
I have a question. In your book, you mentioned about caste data and how some even like with the food and agricultural data, it was kind of like when you went to different like houses to ask people and how they would underreport stuff like meat consumption, because they were scared that like people in the community would find out and that kind of thing. So there are very real fears on like the grassroots level of like actually reporting to people who are collecting such data about like, what kind of food do we eat and all of that kind of thing. And so they have the full right to like kind of restrict that data from like official statistics. But at the same time, there's the argument of like we need to have like more transparent and more like just a higher level of data generally, and like for better policy making and like better development. But yeah, so how do you like kind of balance those two out, like of understanding that people have a right to like restrict what data they give to the government versus like the government also needing that data for policy?
Okay, great question. And yeah, while I have not found, while I am not able to establish underreporting, what I do in the book on meat consumption is quote other people who have, because for the very points that you make, it is entirely, it is something that you can entirely are likely to expect. I think, there are similar questions around possible underestimation of the experience of things like sexual violence. I mean, to expect that people are, the NFHS follows all these rules, it has to be in a separate room, all of that, but the expectation that the NFHS is accurately measuring the experience of sexual crime is to be disingenuous. I also think this is going to be a problem with the census whenever it is conducted, that having weaponized citizenship to the extent that it was, expecting people to accurately report things like migration and citizenship is a crazy thing to expect. And in the census in particular, you are obliged by law to respond accurately to the census. So you can opt out of the NSSO, but you cannot opt out of the Indian census. So I think the way academics, I don't have a way to solve it, but the way academics sort of try to fill in the blanks here would be to do smaller, more qualitative surveys. So as we see with crime, for example, which I mentioned in the book, is that you would expect that it's possible that India underreports property crime. And then smaller surveys done in places like Rajasthan show that that is the case, that property crime is heavily underestimated. And then who underestimates it? Maybe people who feel that the police are not going to listen to them, So figuring out extent of underestimation through a separate survey is the best way to at least fill in gaps in your knowledge. It's not going to allow you to change that original number, but at least when you're talking about it, you have this sort of full background information. So that's at least the way I sort of try to deal with it. And yes, at the level of the individual answering, it's entirely, it's not just their right to not respond, but it's also contingent on surveyors to think of the specific circumstances. So, we've talked about sexual violence and the modes that need to be put in place for that. But I don't think there's any particular thought that's been given to questions around migration and citizenship for the census, because there isn't even an acknowledgement that it is now a dangerous thing to answer in India. Similarly, around interreligious marriage, I don't think, it's a dangerous question to answer now in India, but I don't think, at least on official statistics, there's no acknowledgement of that yet.
Yeah, please.
I'm Asim. We've spoken in India. We have never actually met in person, so it's a pleasure meeting you here and listening to your talk. I actually just wanted to bring back some of the changes in the data landscape itself. And of course, there is the state question and how much capacity it has. But in the digital age, you also have huge intermediaries. And we had a brief discussion at that time. But since then, for example, Google or Twitter or Instagram, Facebook would have a lot more of our daily lives recorded than perhaps any agency could dream of. What is your experience with or understanding of how this landscape is now shaping our capacity as a public, not just as a state? And secondly, relatedly, I think following from your question about veracity of data, is there this public-spirited community that, can you just delve a little bit? Is it, my sense is like South Indian states have it much better. I come from Rajasthan. Mm-hmm. We just, so can it be generated, or is it has to be imported? So
Okay.
what is the sense? Like, is it Madras will do it or Chennai will do it always better than Delhi? Is it just the maths history of statistics, or is it something that can be learnt and not just imported? Thank you.
Let's take one more question. Yeah, please, yeah, and then we. So you can answer the two together. Is that okay? Rukmini, is
Yes,
that-
absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you, Rukmini. Thank you for your important work. And it's sort of related a little bit to the previous question, which is to say this kind of this contradiction which you kind of it emerges in your work, which is on one hand the proliferation of public data portals and dashboards, and supposedly like all this data is now, or at least large parts of it, are in the public domain. The different ministries have varying capacities of the analytics that they do on the data that they collect, and on the other hand, you kind of shine the light on the stage at the back, which is how is this data collected, the quality of that data infrastructure itself. And so maybe just wanted to ask you a little bit about, what is your sense of kind of the front-facing, flashy, snazzy dashboards, and then this kind of crumbling kind of architecture at the back, and yeah, just your take on that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Such great questions. So the great omission in my book is any data from any of the big tech companies, and it's not out of not asking; it's out of not getting. And again, this is something that I think perhaps for the 6 months after the book came out, I did some hand wringing about it. But again, I feel like now we're reaching a point where there are people reaching out saying, "Hey, we work within these big companies." I don't mean people seeking to leak data, but people, again, in this public-spirited way saying, we work within big tech companies, we too feel that this data should be, anonymized, and secure parts of it that feed into public policy should be made available in a greater way to journalists and others. What should we do about it? Is there a way we can come together to build some sort of compact on what are the key areas that we should be pushing these companies to make available? And it has happened in the past. So for example, Google mobility data being made available so widely during the pandemic ended up feeding into even district and state level decisions around, hey, we're seeing a lot more movement, particularly in these areas, perhaps we should be prepared for a surge in cases, let's make sure that so there are directions at least for talking about these companies that are not legally obliged to share this data, to talk to them in terms of figuring out how, what are the incentives for them that can be created to make some of this data available for journalists and for analysis. So, yeah, again, no answer there, but I'm beginning to see the beginnings of conversation around what can we hope for there.
Sorry to interrupt, but you know that during the pandemic, Raj Chetty produced this work.
Yeah.
Which basically daily GDP based on enormous amounts of private information.
Yeah.
And in some sense, we should also be thinking about,
Absolutely.
kind of leveraging that kind of data.
Absolutely. So typically this is made, individual relationships drive it. So thinking about how people who perhaps do not benefit from those individual relationships can still have access to it would be a sort of broader hope. Sorry, and I also just wanted to bring in something that I've not talked about, but which is the growing role of private data, groups in India who produce data for, these are closed and available for purchase. So this isn't a sort of public good, but their increasing centrality to all big public policy conversations in India, including something as core as unemployment data now, is a huge shift in the landscape in the last few years. And again, thinking about what parts of that data we can sort of push towards having publicly available while respecting that these are private companies who've built this expensive architecture for sale, for this data for sale. Thinking about how we can, sort of grow public access to it is worth thinking about. So this sort of public-spirited thing typically comes together quite loosely, and while yes, I would say that tech-driven people particularly tend to be concentrated in your big cities, not just in the south, but yeah, prominently in Bangalore and Chennai, but in other big cities too. People willing to put in some sort of volunteer effort are across the country. So we don't need that many people with tech abilities for all of these enterprises as well. But we do need enough people, and in fact, some of this is often a combination of field work and with some tech ability, right? So for example, efforts that involved trying to track deaths of migrants who were returning home during the pandemic, or of deaths from lack of oxygen, involved field level and these sorts of collaborations, because it would involve things like scanning through local newspapers or having contacts with local hospitals. So there is a role for people across levels of sort of tech and other access. So, my broad thing, yes, the dashboardification of Indian data is a disease rampant across government. And many in government working with data also complain about it. I mean, they would ideally, for their own decision making, not always want a dashboard. It helps at sort of different levels. Primarily, my sort of answer to, my thought around this is that we have not paid, we as data communicators, and I would say many working with data as well, have not typically paid enough attention to the production of statistics and to the communication of that. So one of the reasons, if I get pushback from people about a number, sometimes you can just sort of brush it off and saying, oh, they don't want to be confronted by reality. But sometimes you have to accept that you've done a poor job of explaining that number. The reason that consumption expenditure, when I tell people that if you spend more than 8,500 rupees a month, which is $100 a month, you're in the top 5% of urban India as per the last unpublished consumption expenditure data. Part of the pushback is because, people imagine they're not part of the elite and there's this huge elite that's hoarding money. But it's also because we've done such a poor job of explaining consumption data that nobody's able to picture what that looks like, and so we don't build credibility in that number. So let people build their dashboards, but let's do a better job of explaining what the data that goes into it looks like, how it was produced, and so what you're seeing on the dashboard, what does it actually mean? Whose data is it? Where does it come from? That's the part that we're currently doing a bad job of explaining, in my view. Yeah.
Ashu.
One comment and two maybe questions. So the comment is about government data on communal violence, Hindu-Muslim violence, which Stephen Wilkinson and I put it together, and for the period 1950 to 1995, and we got ultimate compliment when Devraj Ray, one of the very fine economists we know, decided to use exactly our protocols to extend it all the way to 2018. Exactly the same protocols. So why did we not believe government data on that? It's available. There was something from a political perspective that was telling us, both Stephen and I, that unless we know how government collects this data, how it collects, we shouldn't believe it, because there are times when the government may not want to publish deaths in riots accurately because it's politically damaging. So, especially given the foundations of Indian Republic, which is born in bloodshed, and, 250,000 at least deaths, up to 500,000, and 15 million migrations across the world. So we thought, let's interview some IS officers all of whom have worked at the district level, and then they go to the state capital, and then they come to Delhi, and go back and forth. So let's start with Aligarh, one of the most sensitive towns, and interview district magistrates whom we knew. How exactly is the data collected? So it is the police station officer, that is station SHO, I think that is the term. Station officer, the police not constable, one above, right? Where who categorizes an episode of violence as communal or not. And every 15 days, the district magistrate sends that information to Home Secretary in state capitals. And that data, when requested by Home Secretary of Delhi, of government, is reported. I said, you don't check, so there's no way to check. So are you saying that the station officer at the sub-district level basically decides whether something is communal, something is an episode of communal violence or not? Said yes, we have no capacity to investigate. So we dropped the idea of using, and then we ran tests on newspapers and found actually that for our period, Times of India was the best newspaper in the country, and we called it a journal record. And we have explained why. We didn't pick Indian Express, etc. Didn't pick Hindu. Now, and we couldn't be sure about the exactitude of our data, but we were sure about the reasonableness of it. And so long as certain rules were followed, and Devraj, then when he accepted our rules, we thought we did a very good job. We were not so statistically sophisticated then, our profession, as it is now, right? This work was done in 96, 97. Okay, so the question that follows from that is, do you know of any other realm of data where it is the lowest unit of the government that collects, categorizes, and it's never checked? And it ends up all the way to the top level, all the way to Delhi, right? Without any checks in between. So this is a question that follows. The second is, I think you might know this, but you might have better speculations than most of us. Why was the caste census data not published from 2011? It was collected, why was it not published?
Socioeconomic assets, yeah. The socioeconomic, SECC.
Yeah. And something that is, I've lost track of now, I went to India only after 2-3 years. What is the delay with 2021 census data collection? What exactly is going on? Why? Is it going to be collected, or is there's going to be a 10-year gap and then we have data in 2031?
Thank you. All very hard questions. No, and the example you give is such a great one of trying to understand the production of statistics. And, every time that communal violence is or the police statistics are reported at face value in India, you wish there was this sort of disclaimer that ran alongside that explained how these numbers are actually produced. And this is something I would want across the board for Indian statistics, which is that every time you're using them, you should be almost obliged to explain how they were produced. And I think the sort of broad methodology that you followed is something that people are increasingly beginning to think of whether is needed. So again, the sort of work around both migrant deaths and deaths around lack of oxygen, the sort of thinking behind it was that it's not, you can also do omission by non-categorization. So if you never added a category of death by lack of oxygen in all of this COVID stuff, you can just say we don't have the numbers, there was no category ever created, and then post facto other people have to come up with a solution for how to do it. So the volunteers who did this work, for example, relied on things like ground level contacts, use of media. There's a couple of things that I have, there's one major concern that I have, which is that the incentives of the news media in India are right now are so complicated and so warped on so many dimensions that its use now of any, if not one, even multiple newspapers to produce this sort of work going forward into the future worries me. I know people are doing it, and now with machine learning, this is something that can happen much better. So I know people are doing it, but having seen the incentives of the news media from the inside, I worry about, just as I worry as the FIR as the building block to understand crime, I worry about the Indian media as a building block to understand anything right now.
But are you saying that Times of India in that 1950 to 1990 period, its internal, I've given a talk to Times of India also, and I complimented them from data. Some of the younger ones didn't believe that their data was that good. Older ones actually believed that they were doing a terrific job. And in the 50s and 60s, the standards that Times of India had were virtually unimpeachable.
So we think.
Were the incentives very different then?
Yeah, exactly.
That's the point you're making, right? Incentives
think so.
today
Yeah.
lead to misreporting more than accurate reporting. Incentives then were very different.
I do think so, with the caveat that that I'm sure there were problematic incentives in the past as well, which I understand less well. I at least understand the dimensions around which these incentives are stacked now. And those worry me, and I would say worry me particularly in the case of, I would say, communal violence. So good luck to someone trying to do it now using any, perhaps you can use a range of sources. I'm sure there are ways to think about it. So this, the other sources where the lowest unit, pushes the data forward with no check. There are examples including medical certification of cause of death, which goes virtually unchecked going forward. But I also think it brings me to another point, which is there is often, including from people like me, I think, for a long time, a great suspicion of administrative data in India, sometimes driven by a feeling that, and this is how, Anganwadi workers have been treated, that the incentives on them to falsify or misreport or not accurately report data are for some reason greater than we assume from the average surveyor. So we have always, not trusted administrative data for reasons that now quantitative work is showing are not very well borne out. So we are finding in work by others that Anganwadi workers are potentially doing a pretty good job of getting administrative data right. The incentives are actually misaligned further down the line. So figuring out that sort of life cycle of the data and where things are getting messed up.
You mean further up the line?
Sorry, further up the line, yes. I would actually encourage many more people to work on that, because to me it seems like an essential part of, we need to be able to use administrative data more. We're producing so much of it. All state governments also want to do more with their administrative data, but currently people like me from the outside cannot understand how this data can be used right now. So the more work that others comes, which helps give context to data to figure out where things are going right or wrong, would help going forward. On the caste census, I mean, the pushback among politicians and upper caste groups has been enormous against the caste census. The sense that this shouldn't be done has been enormous. There are data problems as well. The way, the categories in which the data, I mean, they're not problems. They need a serious commitment to sorting that data out. So when it became sort of politically problematic, there was a committee formed, and I believe that committee took months without making any headway in the data because of the number of sort of variables, number of sort of differences in difficulty in coding the data. So if the government decides that it wants to make this a priority, which I don't believe either of the big two political parties have thrown their weight behind making this data available, it would need a fair amount of data work as well. So all of that is far from happening from what I see. On the 2021 census, I really do not have a good answer, because I do not think that there is a good reason for this government to not want a census. I mean,
has the work begun on the census?
No. It's not started now. There was a date given for the next round of notification. I really actually don't have a good answer. For a while it seemed like it was expedient going into the pandemic, since we just had the CA NRC protest, that it was expedient then, but then the pandemic happened, and now I don't have a good answer.
Arvind, can I take 2-3 more minutes on this caste question? So there's a book by Nick, Columbia guy? Nick Dirks. And it's very relevant to anyone who's working on caste. I think here is one way to picturize what was happening. 1931 census, right? The last caste census. The census officer and his deputies, not the top guys, let's say going to Tamil Nadu and asking 31, this was given up altogether after that, right? Meet Chettiar. What are you? No, and they say, I'm Chettiar. So, no, Chettiar, what do you do? Bank. Oh, so you're a businessman, you're a Vaishya. No, I'm not Vaishya, I'm Chettiar. No, you're Vaishya, these are the categories here, right? So, this kind of problem, Brahmin category was all India category, Dalit category was all India category, right? But in Kshatriya was not all India, Vaishya was not all India, and OBC is of course not all India, right? So, a caste system which is radically decentralized, other than the top category and the bottom category, right? Radically decentralized, was being put into national level caste categories. And the radical local decentralization and the centralized category construction couldn't be brought together. That is, I think, what you're calling data problems. This is not a political issue. This is simply how do you represent the lived reality with categories that you may have developed.
No, but
This is when Nick Dirks says that the Chettiars were being told you're Vaishya. Chettiars, no, we are not Vaishya. We're Chettiars, etc. So,
I think she had a question, please.
Sorry. So I think my question about all of it is, so essentially sometimes what I've been doing in research as work has largely been interviewing folks. And so what I essentially do is the baseline job of it. And so one hesitation that I've often seen, and this is a very micro question that I'm hoping leads it to a larger conversation, but participants or folks that you're interviewing that come in that you actually talk to have always complained about a tendency of data hoarding and the need to kind of ask, why do you need particular kinds of data? And me being in the position of being someone who was collecting the data often had no response to that question itself. And I think that's something I've seen in research by institutions mostly, and that to private institutions, even not public institutions, which is largely that then you can kind of have a commentary on everything happening in the world if you have numbers for everything happening, but you never provide context. And so in that way, when folks even answer any of these questions, they keep that in mind even in the answering part of it. So even when we talk about quantitative data in some way, there's such a big qualitative element that I feel like is fundamentally missing in the process of collecting the data itself, because it's even the interviewer sitting over there and communicating why I'm collecting the data from you. And if you can't actually justify your reason for doing that, I feel like then the data you're getting isn't accurate. And so I'm wondering, when we talk about data problems in general or accuracy of data and all of that, do you think there's a communication piece problem over there of intention of data collection that comes into question when we're talking about the inaccuracy of data that is collected?
No, I think that's a great question, and I think that's entirely, it's an important dimension to consider. I think you see this quite upfront when it comes to opinion polling that feeds into elections, for example. It feeds into electoral forecasting, which has become the sort of number one job of opinion polling in India, not into, although that same data is then, if you're going to use this data to just produce forecasts, that's fine. Yeah. But this same body of research has been used to produce all manner of theories around the Indian voter, Indian politics, the compact of the Indian voter with Indian politics, all of this, which leads to things like unemployment always being the number one question for why Indian voter ever says they're voting for the party that they're voting for. I mean, you've had unemployment move from being very high, very low, and not in any way being explanatory to electoral outcomes, which doesn't make anybody think twice about how they're asking questions. So these questions are often being asked before an election when there's a very real perception of the danger associated with answering those questions, all of these sort of, which could potentially feed into these responses. So, I'm completely willing to believe that this is an understood dimension of answers, and I think we see it quite directly when it comes to questions around voting in particular. Yeah.
Here, please.
This is a fantastic one. I really, sorry. I think I can be heard.
You won't be recorded otherwise.
Okay, okay.
You need to.
Thank you. I actually really enjoyed, the kind of spatial differentiation of moving from a police station to a court, and what kind of happens in just that movement, and how that was pretty illuminating, and I thought that's also kind of indicative of how we collect data, where we collect data, who we collect it from, and what it says about the social reality that we live in. But that being said, I was actually kind of wanted to follow up on Asim's question about the intermediaries, right? Mm-hmm. So he's talking about a very different kind of intermediary, like the big tech companies and the data that they hoard. But I actually was going to ask you about the intermediaries that exist in these spaces currently, right? So and I think the report that you're working on, the urban centers of India currently, shows a significant role that intermediaries play in access to basic services, right? My supposition about the Indian state is that they do play a massive role in how people actually communicate with bureaucratic services, right? So I was actually wondering about the kind of, role that they potentially have in kind of obfuscating some of the data that is generated by these mechanisms, these survey mechanisms, or these administrative authorities that we rely on a lot of information for. So, and also what is their relationship to institutions such as the Google and Facebook, etc., which hoard a lot of data today. And second question, Could
you just give me an example of what these existing intermediaries are?
Existing intermediaries, matlab dalals and brokers, okay. And and this is essentially land brokers, right? Mm-hmm. Who are kind of making these property visible to a large section. Without these brokers, you cannot kind of access property, right? Mm-hmm. So how do you kind of think about property in terms of the intermediaries that exist in these spaces, right? First of all. And second of all, oh my God, that brings me to the land data, right? And the kind of, what is it called? It's like a database, statistical MIS that they have created, which has codified all of the property data in most of the states. And they have these high numbers, 93% of the data has been digitized. But actually, when you look at the property layers, the maps, right? 2%. 2% of the maps have actually been digitized, and they are now using drones to kind of, make them, visible. But that's obviously not taking off, right? And there is a reason as to why this happens. So, because it's an intensely political process, and it's deeply engendered in our caste and societal norms, right? So in that case, that actually takes me back to Ashu's question, is these structural fundamental issues that we have in creating data in the first place. So, I mean, sorry, and this is there's a skepticism coming in a little bit, the kind of, the CRS that we talked about, right? Does that actually provide a counter to this kind of structural, fundamental way in which we have constructed society in India?
Oh my.
Sorry.
I don't feel smart enough to take this
No.
on.
It's not. It's a very simple question in the sense that, it's such a, there is a reason why some things are obfuscated in Indian society. There are caste category. The problem of why the caste census has not been done since 1931, right? Even after Nehru Mahanopolis's push towards a statistical modern state. So and those problems that you essentially said, the 20-year-olds are marrying in the same way that the 90-year-olds are marrying. So do you think that if we still kind of persist towards understanding of society in this modernist way, we can actually, find a solution? Like, is this the kind of route we should be taking towards finding a solution towards a very structural problem?
I think we're reached the bewitching hour. So, and there are two more questions. Let's take the question.
Yeah.
Let's take the questions. There are two
take
more,
the
and then
question.
you can respond together.
Sure, yes.
Yeah. Please, quick, yeah, if you don't mind.
Just a contextual, sexual violence question. Is the data further aggregated by area, urban, rural, also children, male, or do the universities in India use data sexual violence?
Thank you, Rukmini. I learned a lot today. So this is sort of tying down the whole discussion about what are the incentives for data collection, and I'm wondering what role does economic theory possibly have to play in like understanding these incentives. So just two examples from my own work. Like one I was telling you about, where I'm looking at the route of the Ram Rath Yatra to and then use Professor Varshney's data to predict riots. And the other example is using medical records or actually emergency records to get a proxy for data for the numbers on sexual violence in Haryana, because they have one-stop crisis centers.
They've got what, sorry?
One-stop, they call them one-stop crisis centers. So Amir Khan did a feature on them on Satyamev Jayate. So the reason that I am doing this is because I want to get rid of like this misalignment of incentives in data reporting to get some sort of exogenous variation in these factors I'm interested in studying. But I think like my question, especially like reaching out to a wider audience with this body of literature, is that I'm always faced with the question, why am I using an instrumental variable when I could have just used, the existing data on riots or the crime bureau data on sexual violence. So I think like my question is more about, like I do see a solution to the data collection misalignment, and I think it also comes very nicely in your book from the different sources of data from which we can measure behavior. But I think my question is more about how do we convey that, how do we communicate science, and how do we tell people that we're doing this because of this misalignment problem.
Okay, you have the last words on.
I'm going to start by saying I've never been more acutely aware of the fact that I've not studied economics and politics than while answering these questions. I'll take the easiest one first. So, yes, sexual violence data in India is, as it is reported to the police, is divided, does have these sort of cross tabs of region and other. Indian college campuses do not separately maintain this data, but by we have age group data, so it allows us some of this. But all of this data then suffers from the. So I think there's good reasons for great skepticism around all sexual violence data involving people in their late teens in India because of this extent of criminalization of sexual agency among young people. And we're seeing this played out in the data as well. I'm going to pick the easiest parts of your question and just talk about one aspect of this property data, which also brings me to, when I talked about private data groups earlier, there are your big well-known ones. And then there are a lot of intermediaries who, in a sense, rely on loose privacy laws, and you would not even know that all of it. So, for example, I registered a one-person company, and I had 6 human individuals from 6 banks show up at my house the next day to offer me loans. Not even spam text or actually showing up. So, You see this particularly when it comes to property, because that is particularly valuable information. So I've seen a proliferation of startups with questionable data sources. It just brings me to, I'm just going to bring in one. When I did a presentation for a group of bureaucrats in one state, and I pulled up to talk about sort of India's statistical architecture, I pulled up a picture of surveyor standing in a field in the 1930s in Bengal, and I was talking about how the Bengal government then was trying to estimate crop yields, and one of the things they did, sort of famous experiment, was to look at the plot by plot estimates, and then Mahalanobis was trying to sort of pilot what sample surveys looked like, and then did a sample survey. They did both, and then the sample survey came closest to the actual number, so it was a good demonstration of sample surveys being good. And at the end of the talk, the bureaucrat came over to me and said, you know what I'm trying to figure out right now? I'm trying to figure out how to accurately measure crops, plot sizes and estimate crop yield. 90 years, and his key problem was essentially unchanged. So on the one hand, we have this, literally this dark web going on with property data and private companies, but the fundamental question of how to align incentives to get plot size right is virtually unsolved. And yes, every few years there'll be a new thing.
Drone.
Now we'll do satellites, now we'll do drones. That's the only thing that's changed. I have no solution. This is just my observation on this. On your question, so yes, I would think that this would typically, and this communicating these other variables then often veers into the pushback is, do you not trust the government? Is there something, why aren't you believing the government data? So these sort of ways of, doing very narrative demonstrations of what the data is getting wrong is essentially, I think, the best way to get past it. Of all of the journalism I have done till date, the part about this disconnect between police statistics and court data has been the most long-lasting, because I did that, I think, 7 years ago, and I still hear of it being cited when things like this come up. So a really sort of striking, so the example you're mentioning in Haryana, I can well see that for a region or for a neighborhood, if you were able to show this disconnect between what the government data shows and what you were finding, it would change minds to that extent, particularly for information that is so relatable and has so much to do with people's lives. One good narrative demonstration of this disconnect, it's not a very good, I don't have I can't help you. I can't help people in academia. I can help journalists, because for journalists, these sorts of descriptions are easy to do. I don't know how that would translate into your work.
So Rukmini, before I thank you, there is, just on a personal note, one category of problems we haven't touched upon, which I, working in government, found actually, it was like a moment of epiphany, which is how much good data that there exists, which is not divulged and not used. I'll give you two examples. In one of the economic surveys we wrote, we used the train data to calculate migration across, and the second most egregious one is GST data. I mean, I think what Archimedes said, give me a lever and a place to stand and I'll lift the world. I mean, if you gave me literally 10 people in 3 months, I could use the GST data to do GDP stuff, like this. And that's been there for 6 years. It's fantastic data. So there are as many things of, having them and not using them, good data. It's not as much as all the problems that you've
I'll just say one thing, which is to say, I'm working on a solution.
Oh, good. In fact, that was one of the questions I was going to ask you, to tell us what you were going to do next. But maybe over dinner.
Yes, I can't be public about it yet, but we'll talk about it over dinner.
So let me thank all of you for coming. It's been a great session. And above all, Rukmini, as you said, we've learned a lot. Reading your book, also all the work that you've done, pioneering work, it's really been, really set the standard for, getting the truth out, for bravery, especially when COVID happened, the stuff that so many of you were doing in Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh, Chennai, Tamil Nadu, it's really, I think, changed the landscape so well. So thank you very, very much for not just the presentation, but for all